Okay, guys, today we're going to be addressing indicator 1.3 and our standards for world history. And most of 1.3 includes most of the information on the age of exploration. And part of that indicator is going to be the part about the slave trade. So we're going to address the slave trade today, and we're going to look at a couple of other things along with that as well. So with that being said, let's get started into discussing the slave trade. Again, here's an actual clip from the time period that was featured in a newspaper, so you can see how these uh, early colonists and people in the New World viewed slaves initially. And of course, this is a good example of that. And this was done in Charlestown, which is Charleston for us. So the Atlantic slave trade, when does it take place? Well, it's going to take place um, really from 1450 all the way to 1865. So we got a good lengthy time span of almost 400 years. The Spanish and the Portuguese were the ones to first bring over slaves from Africa and eventually bring them to the New World. By 1865, slavery would come to an end in the United States, even though slavery, people were still smuggling in slaves even after the Civil War. But technically, it was made illegal around 1807, 1808. It was banned officially in Great Britain and in England around that time period. So, why did slavery begin? And there's three reasons. Mainly labor shortage. There was not enough workers. Remember, we had discussed this where we talked about the Native Americans dying off, and especially in the Americas, they needed workers that could work these large plantations, and so this sort of pushed the idea of slavery. The other one is ethnocentrism, and this is a big word. It's basically meaning that you think you're far more superior than anyone else, and of course, some of the Europeans viewed themselves in that light. And then the last is greed, the need to make as much money and as much wealth as possible by using slaves and getting a lot of these cash crops and selling them. It meant more money for these European countries at that point. So slaves were coming from Africa, mainly West Africa. If you don't know that, you definitely want to write that down. You can see where they were going to. Often they were shipped to the Caribbean islands before they were transferred into the Americas, into North and South America. They were sort of conditioned there at first before they were sent to these plantations in South America and North America. So you can see the percentages of areas where most of the African slaves were coming from and where they went to. So, how many people were enslaved? 30 million were taken from their homes. 10 million would die during the capture phase, and 10 million would die in the middle passage, when the crossing of the Atlantic. 10 million survived to make it over the ocean. So, what were the phases of the slave trade? And there's a couple of them, so be prepared to write these down. The first phase was capture. Most were captured within 50 to 100 miles inland in Africa. And usually these Africans were captured because there were warring tribes and they were prisoners of war. So a lot of them were captured and then sold off to the slave traders. This was pretty much their way of dividing and conquering each one of the tribes and to try to gain superiority. Remember, most of these slaves were traded for guns. The more tribes that had guns, the far more powerful they felt, and they could defeat their neighbors around them. So, what was the West African expectations about slavery? Um, that slaves were not slaves for life at first, and that a slave's child would not be a slave. Now, we know that not to be the case when they got to the Americas, but in most cases, this is how they thought, that these people were not going to be slaves forever. Again, these are showing some of the forts that were along the coast of Africa. These forts were where a lot of these slaves were brought to and then eventually sold off. The second phase of the slave trade was the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage, again, is the journey over the Atlantic Ocean. 400 to 500 people were crowded in a boat with little air and a lot of disease that went on. Most of them did not. They would lose a good many of them crossing the Atlantic Ocean. During the Middle Passage, there was a couple of ways that they would actually organize slaves on the ships. They would have a tight pack, which means they put as many as they could into the boat. This often meant higher mortality or higher death rates, but it also meant more profits for the slave traders. This is an example of tight pack. And you can see how the slaves are lined up row by row, side by side, pretty much bolted down to the bottom of the boat, which is not a very good thing to think about. The other way that they would ship slaves was through something called loose pack. This meant lower mortality, lower death rates, but it also meant lower profits because naturally you couldn't pack as many slaves on a ship as you could the other way. Again, this is a picture of loose pack along the Middle Passage. And then one of the final phases was seasoning. Seasoning is where they would actually ship them to the Caribbean islands for about 4 to 5 months to learn how to become a slave, if you can imagine that. But these were brutal work camps in the Caribbean islands, often in sugarcane fields, chopping down sugarcane for the most part. Again, the whole purpose behind this seasoning phase of the slave trade was meant to train people to become slaves. So a question you need to think about, given how many people died during the capture phase or on the Middle Passage, what do you think went on in the minds of the slave catchers and the slave traders? So think about that for just a minute, and you might want to jot that down too, and then let's move on. Of course, part of the slave trade is the idea of the triangular trade, and of course, this involved the shipment of goods and people, which the slaves were, back and forth between Europe, North America, Africa, and the Caribbean. And of course, this meant the transfer of rum and weapons to Africa in return for slaves, and then the slaves were brought to the Caribbean, and then the whole process started all over again. And often we use Europe rather than North America because these manufactured goods were being traded from Europe. The Europeans were mainly the ones who were initially bringing the slaves to the Americas. So why did they choose Africans? There's a couple of reasons. Of course, the plantation owners were desperate for labor. A lot of the Native Americans didn't work out as slaves. They died because of smallpox. And Africans were more familiar with that whole process of planting and farming. It was harder for Africans to run away than the Native Americans. And like I just said, the African strength included agricultural practices, and they were more resistant to the European diseases. So those would have been the reasons why Africans were chosen. So how did some of the African slaves fight back against slavery? Sometimes they would revolt, or sometimes they would work very, very slow. They would often break tools and sometimes even poison the food that they were harvesting. So these were a couple of ways that they fought back against the idea of slavery. So while many slaves resisted, not all of them did. What did they have to lose? That's another thinking question for you to think about. You might want to jot that down and jot down an answer. So how much did slavery grow? From 1800, it was at 1 million. By 1860, it was at 4 million, 1/3 of the southern population. So, and of course, the invention of the cotton gin is going to cause the explosion of slavery in the South. The idea that cotton is a cash crop, major cash crop. And so, again, slavery exploded mainly due to the cotton gin and cotton. Again, why did it grow? Well, again, like I just said, the cotton gin was invented in 1793 by Eli Whitney. It made slavery very productive at that point because you could get more cotton out of the fields. It was 100 times faster than by hand than actually picking the cotton. And of course, the cotton still had to be picked, but you had to actually take the seeds out of the cotton. And the cotton gin's main purpose was to pull those seeds out. It was more efficient, and that meant more money, so they needed more slaves. Okay, that's going to do it for the slave trade. Please make sure that you have all these notes. Answer your learning objective questions, which are at the end of your sheet. And that's going to do it, and we will be moving on. We'll catch you guys on the next one.